So, conditions for consistent and self-consistent explanations. First of all, we have to say what we're talking about in terms of actual experience. That's the first thing. Second thing, if we bring in new entities, we describe those in terms of what we already know, directly. If you... And then explanations can only be consistent if they correspond to our descriptions. A consistent explanation must correspond to a consistent description. So, for example, when mechanists say that consciousness comes from matter, now if we analyze, well, what do you mean by matter? Matter is what I'm conscious of. Matter it's my experience of matter, actually. That's all I have. So what they're saying is that consciousness comes from matter, which is what I'm conscious of. So consciousness comes from something that I'm conscious of. This doesn't make sense. Whereas the Vedic worldview does. The Vedic worldview says that the world exists, our experience of the world exists in our consciousness. So then we take consciousness as the prime reality, and from consciousness matter comes. Louis Pasteur, he said that now you say that consciousness comes from matter, but how do you know in 100 years you won't be saying that matter comes from consciousness? But the Vedic view is already that. Not only you have to describe the system that you're looking at, but also you have to describe the process that you're using to look at it. I'll give an example. The criterion for objective knowledge is two important criteria. First is you have to be objective. And the second is intersubjective verifiability. That means that any number of subjects can look at a particular system, get the same readings, measurements, and come to the same conclusions. Now, let's have a look at those criteria. First of all, objectivity. Who can be objective? An object can't be objective. Objectivity is a subjective point of view. It's a subjective attitude. So that implies the existence of the subject. First criterion. Second criterion, intersubjective verifiability. Okay, well, right there it's talking about a lot of subjects. So the subject is actually there in the criteria of physical science, mechanistic science. So you can't deny the subject. Not only the subject is there, but they're talking about intersubjective verifiability. That means there's a correspondence between the different subjects. So then we're talking about the intersubject. There's got to be some basis, some matrix for them all to exist and agree. Intersubject is what we're talking about, the universal self. So if you look at science, the process, then you have to accept what's built into the assumptions. And in fact, objective science can't really tell us what the world's about. All it can do is to compare readings, compare results of particular experiments. And in terms of reality, you can't, the objective method can't come up with a more reliable view of reality than what is already built into its assumptions. So science, you're already assuming, in order to do science, you're assuming the reality of the conscious scientist. So then you have to accept the conscious self. You're assuming that there's a correspondence between everybody in or all the scientists in the scientific community. So you're assuming a conscious matrix and basis for everything. Then also, if to get reliable knowledge, we want to deal with experience rather than plausible stories. The whole of the modern, the present scientific view of life, generally accepted scientific view of life, is simply fables. It's myth. The whole thing. The myth of everything coming from nothing, the myth of the expansion of time-space, the myth of life coming from matter, the myth of self-assembling of living cells, the myth of biological evolution, the myth of human beings coming from apes, the myth of genetic mutation. None of these things are objects of direct experience. They're all ideas that somebody has thought up, and then they try and justify them. And science has come to be an effort to justify the status quo which was created by the scientists themselves. This is the state. So we reject that way of finding knowledge. We say that you have to examine experience, both the field of experience and the person who's experiencing, but we have to examine under the guidance of a self-realized teacher. Not that we have to accept blindly the Vedic authority. It's like this, and you become a robot again, just accepting religious faith. No. The framework is there, and within that framework we can understand reality and understand also what is the purpose of reality. What is the purpose of this world? The real prime reality is consciousness, but we're becoming embedded in matter. That's the wrong way. Our business is to become more conscious. That is the purpose of life, is to become more conscious, less dependent on matter instead of more dependent on matter, and ultimately to have a relationship with the universal self which is completely free from matter altogether, to have a relationship with the Supreme Personality. So, according to these criteria for certain knowledge, we see that the Vedic view, these basic principles that I've put forward, they're consistent, they're self-consistent, they're constructive also, positive. They lead to a real way of life that makes sense and has meaning. Whereas the mechanistic point of view, it's not consistent with known facts, it invalidates itself, and it doesn't give any meaning to life. Rather, because it's denying the subject, it removes subjective values and leads to a chaotic society which is just based on what the principle of enjoying and controlling. So the way forward in modern society is to take in these principles, and the urgent need in modern society is a class of people who can understand the science of the individual conscious self and the universal self, realize the nature of consciousness, at least to some degree, and propagate these principles in society at large. Then society can become whole.